Welcome to another episode of the Politics Shed podcast, which supports the work, or is supported by the work, on the Politics Shed website, which you can find in the links below. In this episode, I'll discuss political parties, the origin of political parties, the functions of political parties, types of political parties, and party systems. And I'll end by considering whether parties are good for democracy. So let's first then start with the origins of political parties. You can take the view that political parties started when the first groups of humans got together and started arguing over something or other. In other words, they simply reflect the differences between us, the differences in status, ability, interests, property ownership, views of the world, psychological upbringing, and so on. These differences between human beings might be characterized in a habit of forming groups. Before the late 19th century, political parties may have been referred to as factions, and they were found from ancient Greece to ancient Rome, the populares, the optimates, and they're mentioned by Plato and Aristotle as being characteristic of political activity. But parties as we mean them today are best understood through looking at the functions they perform. And this leads to the question of whether political parties are essential and inevitable. Slightly different questions. If inevitable, they result from, as I said, human behaviour. If essential, they form a necessary contribution to the workings of representative democracy. And this is an argument you'll hear commonly held, that representative democracy simply couldn't work without political parties. And to understand that argument, you have to look at the function of political parties, which we'll come to after we look a little bit more at their origin. I shall, in subsequent podcasts, be looking at the origins and development of the Conservative Party, Labour Party, and other smaller parties in the UK. But parties before the late 19th century effectively were groupings of people within Parliament. The Whigs, the Royalists, the Conservatives, the Tories, and they divided over an ideological view of the power of the king. But it's really with the development of a wider franchise, when most men obtained the vote by the end of the 19th century, and then men and women over the age of 21 and later over the age of 18 achieved the vote. This steady increase in the size of the franchise, those with the right to vote, results in a necessity to campaign, to raise money, and to have organisations which extend beyond Parliament. The Conservative Party, which existed in Parliament before the age of modern parties, created an extensive national organisation. The Labour Party, which existed outside of Parliament, again formed national organisations, as did the Liberals, and they performed the necessary functions of campaigning. So what are the functions of political parties? And why do some people argue essential to the functioning of representative democracy? First, and I've already mentioned one, political parties seek to obtain elected office. In so doing, they try to achieve elected office by winning elections. This involves fundraising, selecting candidates, recruiting supporters, and campaigning. This may involve delivering leaflets or knocking at doors or organising meetings, and so on. Winning elections defines what a political party is for: achieving office. And the machinery of the party is devoted towards this aim. A second function of political parties is the recruitment, training, and preparation of candidates to run for elected office, since in a representative democracy, we are electing people to represent constituencies who go on to choose government, but also participate in government. So we need to select people who are suited to the role of being in government, or being legislators. Later on, towards the end of this podcast, I'll consider whether political parties are good for democracy, and we may question some of these functions and how well they perform them. But let's move on with simply saying what political parties are for. So first we have campaigning. Second, selecting candidates. Third, making elections altogether more efficient. Imagine if there were no political parties in the UK. We still had 650 constituencies. In each constituency, people voted to choose the best person they thought to become an MP. We judged them on their personal qualities, whether we liked them, the promises they personally made, their own individual qualities, abilities, personalities, and so on. And we sent them off to Parliament to become MPs. First of all, it would be quite difficult for us to do this. I don't know about you, but it's difficult to form a clear understanding of people's characteristics, personality, in a local constituency. I'm not sure I fully appreciate the qualities of my local MP, and indeed all the candidates who might seek to replace them. I want to know, in essence, what it is they stand for. They can, of course, tell me this, and this will involve some effort on my part. But if someone says to me simply that they have a label Conservative, or Labour, or Liberal, I have immediately some idea of what they stand for. This makes it much easier for me to make a choice. So parties provide an easily understandable label, which carries with it an understanding of the values, beliefs, attitudes of that candidate, since they identify with that label. This makes voting altogether easier, or at least the choice of who to vote for. Let's go back to this imaginary parliament. All the individual MPs, not one of them standing for a particular party, but all of them of good quality and chosen by their constituents, assemble in the House of Commons after the election. Their first role is to choose a government. Since we have a representative democracy, we don't choose governments, we choose the people who choose governments, it would be rather difficult for them. They'd have to agree on who the Prime Minister would be, and then the Prime Minister would have to choose from that number the people he thought best suited to being in government and who might offer him some support and help. A long period of negotiation, discussion might take place. And we, the electorate, though we have chosen someone we believed was good for our constituency, someone we liked, would have had no idea what government might emerge. So when a government did emerge after much negotiation, discussion, argument and selection and so forth, it would be rather a surprise to us. And then they would have to tell us what it was they were going to do, or they would have to simply surprise us with what they did. We'd have no way of holding them to account for the promises they made, since they wouldn't have made any. The party would have been selected from MPs, good people, hoping to do good. So you can see that another function of political parties is making the selection of government easier. Not only voting and choosing the qualities of candidates, but also when we vote, we sort of indirectly choose the government. In fact, it feels that's what we're really doing. Many people will simply say, I voted Labour, I voted Conservative, not I voted for Bob Smith, or I voted for Tim Jones. Voting in Britain is largely based on party loyalty, party identification, and an understanding of what parties stand for. And that gives us, when the election is over, a strong sense that we have in some ways chosen the government, not just our local MP. And the government, from that process, derive permission to rule, a legal right, a legitimacy, and a mandate. Legitimacy is simply the legal right to govern, and they can say we are the government because the people chose us. And they chose not just us, but the things we said we'd do, our manifesto, our list of promises. And in that sense, they claim a mandate or permission to carry out this list of promises. This can have some very practical effects. One is that if a government has promised to do such and such a policy in their manifesto, the House of Lords, according to the Salisbury Convention, won't oppose that or delay it. They'll say, this is what the people specifically gave their permission for you to do. Therefore, it's not for us, the unelected Chamber of Parliament, to delay it in any way. The Salisbury Convention. Governments, of course, will do things they didn't say they were going to do, and they might not do the things they said they were going to do. Again, since parties have expressed a manifesto, we can hold them to account for both of those things. We can say that wasn't in your manifesto, or we can see that it clearly was, and they haven't done it. This makes accountability altogether more effective in a representative democracy. So parties are necessary for giving governments a mandate. They can claim it, and we can hold them to account. Did they do it? Have they carried it out? This enables us to make a much more rational choice between different government programs, if we wish. Although many of us might well identify with parties in terms of our region or tradition or class. You can understand or find out more about party theories of representation and theories of voting behaviour on the Politics Shed website. And so when you look at the functions of political parties, you're asked to conclude that political parties are necessary, indeed essential, for the functioning of a representative democracy. They make choice of candidates so much easier, they make elections function, and they make holding governments to account and giving governments permission altogether easier. Now let's look at types of political party. The first type, and the most obvious to us maybe, are parties like Labour and the Conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. Mass mainstream parties. Parties of this type seek elected office across a broad range of supporters. They claim to seek support from everybody, in all parts of the nation. They may in practice have their core supporters and their most loyal supporters, and they may appeal to certain classes or regions, more than others, but they claim to seek support from everywhere, and run candidates right across the country, even in constituencies or regions where they have little hope of winning. They will tend to have a broad range of policies on most subjects. Their manifesto will cover the environment, the economy, industry, defence, foreign policy, social issues, and so on. They seek government, and they seek a mandate to govern on a broad range of issues, and to enact policies according to their own particular beliefs about society, which they apply to a wide range of issues. In other words, if I said to you, I'm a Labour supporter, you'd understand something about my values and attitudes. You might think that I had a rather optimistic belief in human nature, in government's ability to do things, on the role of government in the economy, and so on. You'd have a broad brushstroke idea of the sorts of things I might like and support. If I said I was a Conservative, you might well think things such as individual responsibility, an emphasis on order and on tradition, or that I had a particular view of the economy where I wanted people to spend their money freely and governments to leave them alone, less interventionist, and so on. Under these broad headings, the parties form a range of policies which seek to appeal to everybody. In other words, they're campaigning. They want to persuade you that their vision, their view of society is best. They're not just appealing to a niche or a region or a group. Niche parties, parties that campaign on a narrow platform of issues, such as leaving the EU, the Referendum Party, or UKIP. Then there are niche parties that campaign in particular regions, seeking to achieve support within a particular region, and they seek to gain the support of people who identify with that particular region, being Scots, being Welsh, being Yorkshire, being Cornish. These parties are not seeking to form a government across the whole of the United Kingdom. They may want to achieve government in Wales or Scotland. They may want more devolved responsibility for a particular region. They are likely to be campaigning on local issues, and so there are single-issue parties, such as the Women's Equality Party, or the Animal Welfare Party, or the Brexit Party, as I mentioned before, or Dr. Richard Taylor of the Independent Kidderminster Hospital and Health Concern Party that won an election in Wye Forest constituency in 2001. He was campaigning to keep Kidderminster Hospital open. So nationalist parties, based upon culture and identity, or issue-based parties, campaigning for a particular issue are different from the mass, broad, umbrella parties, which internally are subdivided into factions or groups. And we can see this when we look at the Conservatives and Labour Party later on, and indeed the Republicans and Democrats in America, that within those broad parties there are a range of different subgroups or factions. So now let's look at what textbooks will describe as party systems. Party systems is a phrase that's used to describe something that persists in a relationship between political parties. It characterises the way parties interact with each other and whether parties achieve power. There are two ways of thinking about party systems. One, and the commonest way, and you'll find it in most textbooks, is to concentrate on the power element. Party systems describe in this way of thinking the likelihood of parties achieving power. So, for instance, in single-party systems, which is different from dominant party systems, in single-party systems generally not thought to be functioning democracies in a liberal democratic sense, one party simply excludes through authoritarian means any other party's chance of winning or simply bans them outright. You might find the current situation in Russia, and indeed most authoritarian societies, one way or another guarantee the existence of a single political party. You might ask why authoritarian systems have parties, and they form some of the functions, even within those societies, of parties in our society. They gather supporters and generate support for the government. You might see this as a propagandist role. Indeed, in Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party continued to have a large national organisation, even though it didn't contest elections. It functioned to harness support and to propagandise. Or in the old Soviet Union, the political party, the Communist Party, functioned to form the fabric of the state itself and organise the organs of government. Party and government machinery were one and the same thing. A dominant one-party system may well be a functioning liberal democracy, where other parties could win elections, but for various traditional reasons, one party wins election after election after election. You could argue this is the case in much of post-war Japan. A two-party system where two parties vie for power in a competitive arrangement. Two-party systems, then, tend to exclude smaller parties, minor parties, not just the niche parties that aren't seeking government, but smaller parties that are seeking government tend to find it difficult to win. This might well describe Britain, the UK, and the United States. Multi-party systems, where there is a high likelihood of coalitions. There are many parties, none of which regularly achieve an overall majority in the representative system, so have to share power. Israel, Germany. So conversely, in two-party systems, or dominant single-party systems, coalitions are rare, if not unknown. Coalitions being when parties share governmental power. You'll notice that all these ways of describing party systems are simply describing access to power. Who's most likely to achieve it? Coalition government, one party, or two parties? So, for instance, in the United States, there are hundreds of political parties, but really only two that are ever likely to achieve power. So we might say they are a two-party system, even though many other parties do exist and can exist, and in theory could win elections. When looking at these systems, we tend to focus on the elections of national governments to describe the system. A broader way of looking at party systems is to look at regional politics and local politics, and what happens in individual constituencies, and this gives a more complex picture of party systems. A second way of thinking about party systems is to look at the impact they have and the role they play, not just the likelihood of them achieving power. Let's first start with the official opposition, in Britain described as Her Majesty's Opposition, although a number of parties who are not in government might form the opposition. The largest of these are given some official recognition. The largest party not in government will be described, though, as the official opposition. Their role, when not in government, is a precarious one. They have to be ready to take over government, therefore provide a reliably coherent opposition, an alternative. This is central to liberal democracy. For liberal democracies, there has to be a sense in which you have a choice at elections. That's real, alternative visions of society. Someone who claims to be able to do things better than the government in power. This is the opposition. While in opposition, they develop policies. Also, they act as a form of scrutiny or oversight, criticising the government, pointing out their failures, offering an alternative by doing so. Since there are no fixed-term parliaments and the choice of the election is open to the Prime Minister, oppositions have to be ready to take over government within as little as a few weeks, from the announcement of an election to the walking in number 10. Might be as little as 10 weeks. So they have to be ready. That means their policies will evolve and change as circumstances change, but as an election approaches, they'll be expected to solidify their policies into an alternative manifesto. The leaders of the major opposition party will be known as the shadow front bench, and the leader of the opposition party, Keir Starmer at the moment, will be considered the alternative Prime Minister, and as such afforded a particular status. For instance, every week on Wednesdays, when there is a half-hour Prime Minister's question time, the leader of the opposition will be given numerous attempts to question the Prime Minister, where all other members are given one question. This dialogue, or verbal battle that takes place each week, symbolises the special status of the opposition and its leader. Other large parties, particularly since 2019 the Scottish National Party, also have some official recognition. They will also be included in question time. Recent changes to the structure of Parliament have given the opposition greater influence when not in power. Reforms to select committees, opposition days, and the Backbench Business Committee, which have allowed opposition parties to have chairs permanently on important select committees, questioned the Prime Minister during the Liaison Committee questioning. These reforms to the House of Commons are labelled the Wright reforms, after Labour backbencher Tony Wright. As a result of his committee on House of Commons reform, a business committee, elected chairs of select committees, have given opposition parties a greater influence. It should also be noted that reforms to the House of Lords, where no party now has an overall majority, has also given the opposition more opportunity to scrutinise, provide an alternative, or place a check on the power of the government. For example, the recent Rwanda Bill, passing through the House of Commons and now in the House of Lords, has become involved in parliamentary ping-pong, where amendments placed in the bill are taken out by the House of Commons, put back by the House of Lords, and taken out by the House of Commons again. This may seem like a kind of game playing. It does give an extended opportunity to examine the merits of the bill and alternative versions of it, and plenty of time for opposition MPs and Lords to express their concerns. Opposition days are allocated in the House of Commons for discussion of subjects chosen by the opposition. That's non-government parties. There are 20 days allocated for this purpose per session. Under Standing Order 14. Generally, these days are seen as relatively unimportant because the votes are whipped, and given the government invariably has an inbuilt majority, they almost always win, and the results, however, are non-binding. There are some high-profile exceptions to this. In 2009, when Gordon Brown's government fell to a shock defeat on the rights of Gurkhas, that's Nepalese soldiers in the British Army, to remain in the UK. A very recent example, when the Scottish National Party was given an opposition day and used it to call for an immediate ceasefire in the conflict in the Gaza Strip. Controversially, the Speaker Lindsay Hoyle chose the Labour Party's motion first for vote and debate. This caused considerable anger among the SNP, and Lindsay Hoyle nearly lost his position as Speaker and certainly lost considerable authority. Opposition days, select committees, the liaison committee, and question times, questions to ministers and questions to the Prime Minister, are the bread and butter of the opposition, as they desperately try to make the news, present themselves as an alternative government that is viable and realistic, with some attractive policies, as well expose the failings of the government in power. Over the last couple of decades, however, other changes to the British Constitution have enhanced the role of smaller parties, parties that may not seek power or seek to influence government only in certain regions. Since the turn of the century, devolved legislatures in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales have given the smaller parties a far greater role. The Greens have been in coalition or cooperative arrangements in Scotland and in Wales. Plaid Cymru has been in coalition in Wales. This has had an effect on these smaller parties. The Greens have gained a reputation as a professional party, capable of taking office, developing policies. Some of the rather more eccentric view of the Greens that once persisted has gone. This has not only been the result of devolution, but also the different voting systems, the additional member system in Scotland and Wales, and the single transferable vote in Northern Ireland. The Liberal Democrats have also established themselves as one of the most effective parties in local government, often winning control of councils. They've made a speciality of local politics and local issues and responding to those. And of course, in 2010, the Liberal Party, though not truly a small party or minor party, took part in government, becoming part of the coalition. And their leader, Nick Clegg, was Deputy Prime Minister. Though this had a calamitous effect on their appeal to the general public, and they went from 40 members of Parliament down to 8 at the next election in 2015, they've continued to make a speciality of local politics and winning by-elections. A recent example is 2022, in the Tiverton and Honiton by-election and the Wakefield by-election, a pair of by-election losses for the government of the day, one in a rural area represented by the Conservatives since 1923, and one in a recently won Red Wall seat, i.e. traditionally Labour seat, which were taken over by the Conservatives in 2019, triggered the resignation of Oliver Dowden as chairman of the Conservative Party and contributed to pressure on the Boris Johnson government and his leadership, which ended soon thereafter. So by-elections, particularly for the Liberals, can be an opportunity for smaller parties to have a moment in the sun. Most of the time, small parties, and indeed the opposition, find it difficult to exert themselves substantially in Westminster. The primary reason for this is numbers. The British electoral system, first past the post, makes it extremely difficult for small parties or parties with their supporters spread widely across the country to win elections. The Green Party have one MP in Parliament, and although a special mention should be given to Caroline Lucas for her energy, first past the post, party funding, and the dominance of the media in what is in effect a two-party culture, make it very difficult for small parties to win elections outside of those regional parties. However, other than by-elections, there are moments when history is on their side. Hung parliaments. In the late 1970s, the Callaghan government formed a pact with the Liberals, not a coalition, but an agreement over certain policies in order to stay in power, since their majority had been whittled away
by by-election defeats. Such arrangements are called confidence and supply, in the sense that the smaller party agrees not to bring the government down in a vote of no confidence, or not to vote the government's budget down, i.e. supply, but doesn't make any commitment to support them on anything else. This is generally done in return for some kind of concession on policies, not to pursue certain policies or to pursue certain policies favourable to the smaller party. After the 2017 election, similarly, a confidence supply arrangement existed between the Theresa May government, which had lost its overall majority in the disastrous 2017 election, and the Democratic Unionist Party, which involved considerable transfer of funds to Northern Ireland. These moments in history, where small parties can have a disproportionate influence on the direction of policy or politics, can be seen as the tail wagging the dog, and certainly an argument for not having proportional representation where this would be altogether more common. The UK Independence Party and its leader, Nigel Farage. It might be fair to say that this small party, who only ever achieved representation in Parliament through the defection of MPs such as Douglas Carswell, and yet may well have shaped the direction of politics in very substantial ways. Fear of UKIP, fear of the loss of Conservative support to UKIP, no doubt heavily influenced David Cameron's decision to hold a referendum on membership of the EU, one he was confident that the government would win and UKIP would be thwarted and the issue of leaving the EU would be successfully kicked into the long grass, at least for a few more years. Since Brexit did happen, UKIP have largely become irrelevant, as have the subsequent Brexit Party, which was formed to encourage the negotiations with the EU, Brexit negotiations that is, to be more forceful. However, in 2023, the emergence of the Reform Party, a kind of right-wing, populist, neoliberal party with socially conservative values and neoliberalist economics, small government, low taxes, that sort of thing, and their claim to be true conservatives, are posing a significant challenge to the Conservative Party, with fears of defections. The one-time chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, defected to the Reform Party. One of the Reform Party founders, and someone who continues to have considerable influence over that party, is Nigel Farage. The current leader, Richard Tice, can expect to win few, if any, constituencies at the next election. But opinion polls show they remain a challenge to the Conservative Party and may seek to replace the Conservative Party as the main party of the right in Britain. So it seems that small parties can have a considerable influence during the periods when the bigger parties lose their dominance. Or, if their popularity is such that the bigger parties change or adapt, alter their policies to accommodate the policies of the smaller parties. This often is an obstacle to the success of small parties. The Liberals have often had their policies and ideas, good ideas, poached by the big parties over the years. The architect of much of the welfare state was William Beveridge, a Liberal, but it was enacted by Labour. In a sense, all the parties are green parties now, and there's no mainstream party that doesn't have an environmental concern or green policies. So the Green Party's 1.1 million votes, which translated into 1 MP, shouldn't be used to indicate that they have no impact. They have had, and their ideas, considerable impact on British politics. It's also doubtful that devolution itself and the transfer of more powers to Scotland and Wales would have happened without the emergence of those nationalist parties. In a sense, devolution was designed to try and glue the Union together and take away some of the appeal of the nationalist parties. The Scottish National Party's dominance of politics in Scotland has not entirely been the plan. However, with their hands on power, the Scottish National Party has pioneered policies on gender recognition, on social welfare, on care for the elderly and the environment, which have proved to be a laboratory of social policy, which has an influence on the politics of the UK as a whole. Small parties can serve to fill a gap in political representation, a gap which occurs because the mainstream major national parties increasingly appear to fail to adequately represent the diverse range of views and interests that make up the political landscape. And certainly Green Party and Green Party policies appeal to the young. And UKIP and Brexit and possibly Reform might well appeal to those working class supporters who feel themselves left aside by the dominance of globalised economics, which has led to the deindustrialisation of some parts of Britain and considerable variations in levels of poverty and income and unemployment. One answer in the future that's been often described is reform to the House of Lords, its abolition and replacement by a Chamber of the Regions, which would see the devolved parliaments and possibly devolved English regions represented in this second chamber, not unsimilar to the upper chambers in France and Germany as they exist today. Conclusion. While minor parties face several insurmountable challenges, the most significant of which is the first-past-the-post electoral system, they do offer voters alternatives during elections and can also influence the established parties and raise awareness and support for specific issues.
How they help or hinder representative democracy may seem like a rather odd question, given that I started this podcast by suggesting that they perform a number of vital functions. However, it is possible to look very critically at political parties, and indeed at the extent to which they are successful in fulfilling those functions. Political parties, to be fair, have had an uneasy relationship with democracy. You may well have heard people say things like, "Why don't they all just work together?" or "Stop being so childish," or "Stop playing politics," or "party politics." Well, illustrious figures such as George Washington and James Madison at the founding of the United States hoped their country would be free of the effects of faction, which is what they call political parties. Political parties, then, are seen as a sort of necessary evil. You have to have them, but you'd sort of rather not. So let's look again at some of the functions they perform and how well they do them. Earlier, I said that political parties act as a sort of bridge between the electorate and the representative assembly, parliament, congress, or whatever. They amalgamate policies derived from a general understanding of how they would wish society to be run. This enables voters to make a clearer choice and to give a more emphatic mandate for a government or for a set of policies. However, of course, this means that political parties run on a broad range of policies, and most electors don't feel that way about politics. They won't support everything a party aims to do or promises to do. These days, it's altogether more likely that people view politics in terms of issues, things they strongly believe in, and things they care little about, or things they disagree with, and these may be contained within the policies of one party. It's highly likely that many supporters of the Labour Party in the 1990s and the beginning of this century were disconcerted
by Labour's aggressive foreign policy, while they supported many other policies. Because parties are broad churches or umbrella parties, they inevitably can't please everybody. However, they will claim to speak for the people, and parties will make statements such as having listened, having achieved a mandate, and so on. Our dissatisfaction with political parties can be shown in the steadily declining membership and our turnout at elections, which has declined until 2001, when it has risen since then. But largely, we don't vote in the kind of numbers we once did, particularly in the 1950s, in the middle of the 20th century. This leads us to another problem with political parties. Their impact, or rather the influence of their membership, may at times not accord with the best interests of a representative democracy or the general views of the people or of the electorate. One of the ways parties perform an important function is said to be the selection of good quality people. Parties enable candidates to gain experience in politics, and parties select people who would be suitable for public office. But do parties select the best people? A stark reminder that this may not always be the case are the number of scandals and politicians who were involved in things such as cash for questions in the 1990s, when backbench MPs accepted money for asking questions in the House of Commons, or the expenses scandal, when a surprisingly large number of MPs seemed willing to cheat on their expenses to make extra money. Then there's the selection of party leaders. Parties generally have become more internally democratic. Back in the 1950s, party selection of leaders was largely confined to MPs. MPs chose the leaders. Within the Conservative Party, this was a somewhat mysterious process where soundings were taken. As parties became more democratic, the Labour Party had to reconcile who could and couldn't vote and the influence of trades unions, and the Conservatives and Liberals extended the choice of leader to their membership. Except with the dwindling number of members, their increasing age, particularly the Conservative Party, a group of little more than 90,000 people chose Liz Truss to be leader. There's little more you can say about that. There is an increasing awareness that many MPs see their role in the House of Commons as being as a bird of passage, a short political career and a lengthy, more lucrative one to follow, as they take advantage of the revolving door and move into consultancy or well-paid directorships. There might be many backbench MPs who wish this were true for them. It's certainly true for anyone who's got anywhere near power. Even a short time in government can result in lucrative earnings later. Then, when it comes to selecting our representatives, the resemblance model of representation, that our representatives should look like us, they should resemble the general population in age, educational background, experience, qualifications, and so on, is far from true. About 1% of current Conservative MPs had working class backgrounds or manual jobs. MPs are still overwhelmingly male, middle-aged, white, and from professional backgrounds, with even the Labour Party having only about 28% of its current MPs who could declare themselves to have had working class jobs before they became MPs. So overall, parties do not tend to select people who look like us, or necessarily are the best people to become politicians. As Groucho Marx once observed, he wouldn't belong to a club that would accept him as a member. Party discipline, which is necessary for the functioning of the House of Commons and representative assemblies, also causes some concern. First of all, there's the culture within the House of Commons particularly, but within politics in the United States and in many other assemblies, which is divisive, confrontational, and game-playing. It can seem to many people, observing representative assemblies in action, parliamentary question times, prime minister's question times, that they are staggeringly out of touch with ordinary lives. Matters little the ordinary people facing their workaday lives and the struggles of making a living. Party discipline also can lead to the concern of an elective dictatorship, where, with a disciplined party, obeying the whips, hoping for patronage and promotion, governments can do as they please. Take us into widely unpopular wars, pass legislation restricting our freedom to protest, or laws which restrict the independence of judges by declaring countries such as Rwanda to be safe when judges, having looked at the evidence, suggest it might not be so. So politics, or party politics, can seem to suggest something divisive and confrontational, and may have led to a broad disengagement with politics. Parties can seem to be tribal, represent one group, one region, one class. Political party funding, which once depended heavily on membership, now rely on sources of income other than party members, particularly large donations from unions or rich individuals. This clearly poses a problem for political parties and for democracy, since he who pays the piper calls the tune. Money results in influence and power. Influence by their donors would undermine democracy. There are strict rules when it comes to how candidates can spend their money. However, spending by political parties and how they fundraise was not particularly well regulated in Britain, largely because large membership parties provided a source of income. This seemed only fair. As party funding has become more of a concern, so the law has tried to respond. Since I'm asking, are parties good for democracy? For representative democracy, that is. You might wonder if I started this podcast by saying that political parties are essential to some of the most important features of representative democracy, then why aren't they publicly funded, as any important service might be? The fact that they're not significantly public funded, although the opposition does receive some support in Parliament, called short money, political parties raise their own sources of revenue. Why? Well, clearly it's something to do with our uneasy attitude to political parties. Think of the problems that funding political parties raise. First, would the larger parties receive more money than the smaller parties? Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But of course, that means the larger parties are given yet another advantage over the smaller parties. The idea that small parties are the large parties of the future, as Labour once was a small party and overtook the Liberals and so on, will be somewhat defeated, or at least another obstacle placed in their way. So the free marketplace of parties would be now interfered with, or managed. And that free marketplace, in some ways, is seen as a way in which parties have to establish themselves as popular. If a party is saying and doing the things that we want them to do and performing a valuable service and developing policies that people like, then it should have no problem recruiting members and raising money. At least we think so. But clearly, they do have these problems, since membership is shrinking and revenue from membership diminishing. If, on the other hand, you decide to fund parties equally, that would also be unfair, since small parties would receive similar funding to large parties. And it would leave us in the rather unpalatable position of funding some rather extreme parties, parties that may not support democracy, parties of the far left and far right. And the concept of taxpayers' money going towards political parties. Taxpayers' money has many calls upon it. Health service, armed forces, other services we might consider more essential than political parties. And again, that may be because of our view of political parties as not being entirely desirable. Currently, public funding of political parties is modest. As I mentioned earlier, short money is money provided to the opposition, to all opposition parties. The largest proportion goes to the largest opposition party in the House of Commons. Similarly, in the House of Lords, money is provided to the opposition parties called Cranborne money. This is used to fund the office of the leader of the opposition and smaller parties' expenses, travel expenses, etc. There are also policy development grants, again open to all parties in the House of Commons. They can use these grants to develop policies for their manifesto. Other subsidies, which really are a form of public funding, are free postage for election campaign material to political parties, and the use of public buildings for meetings, etc. The most significant, and one which differentiates British elections from American elections very substantially, are strict limits on access to television. Party political broadcasts are rationed and limited according to a formula depending on votes given at the last election and numbers of candidates running. Political advertising on television is strictly forbidden and against the law. Of social media is, so far, largely unregulated. The most significant attempt to regulate party spending and party donations was the 2000 Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act. This was part of Labour's attempt to overhaul the constitution, went side by side with things like devolution, investigations into changing the voting system and possible House of Lords reform, and the Human Rights Act. The 2000 Act created an independent electoral commission which was set up to supervise spending in election campaigns. The amount of money that parties could spend was capped, and donations were also limited, and donations from individuals not in the UK were banned. While this was seen as a significant step forward, ironically it did result in Tony Blair becoming the first Prime Minister in British history to be investigated by the police for possible breaches of a law his own government had passed, and that was with the Cash for Honours scandal, in which it appeared that giving honours, or that's membership of the House of Lords, in return for donations to the Labour Party, as was clearly been the case with political parties from Lloyd George onwards, membership of the House of Lords has strongly been linked to donations to political parties, but is now against the law. Tony Blair remained unprosecuted. However, scandals continue, with figures such as Lord Ashcroft, who it was revealed in the Paradise Papers operated a number of shell companies offshore to hide money from taxation, and also become one of the Conservative Party's largest donors. Or recently, Frank Hester, who made appallingly racist comments directed towards the MP Diane Abbott, is currently the Conservative Party's largest donor. But why we don't simply fund political parties as many other democracies do is because we really aren't sure that's what we want to do, as how to do it fairly. Overall, the problem with political parties is a kind of conundrum which is difficult to solve. Parties have to start with a view of society. But are they trying to persuade us of their view or represent what we believe? A party that simply represented everything we believed in would believe in nothing itself. A party that pursued only its own view of the world hoped they could persuade us of that view. If they didn't, they'd be consigned to perpetual failure. So parties try to walk a tightrope between the two. They listen, they persuade, they respond to the people, so they say. At the same time, they try and convince us of their particular view, which they somehow claim we have anyway, if only they could explain it to us properly. Most political failure will be claimed by politicians to be the result of a failure to explain properly. So parties can seem out of touch, narrowly focused, self-interested, and unrepresentative. In a representative democracy, that would seem to be quite a bad thing. Is there an alternative? Well, some might point to different forms of democracy. Sortition, choosing people by lottery. This might take the greater use of direct democracy, petitions and referendums. All of these are to some extent used as an answer to a problem, and that problem is at least partly political parties. That brings this podcast on political parties to an end. If you wish to find out more examples of political parties in action, or look at some of the things I've talked about in greater detail, use the Politics Shed website and the resources collected there, including videos, other podcasts. In future podcasts, I'll consider the parties individually, their history, their origins, and their current policies. Thank you for listening.